Ghost Managed Medicine, I'm just going to say just a quick little promotional bit. It's available open access, so you can, if you find the web page from Mattering Press, you can download it for free. So I'm going to talk today just about key opinion leaders, and I'm going to talk about key opinion leaders in the kind of in the abstract. For those who care about the history of the opinion leader concept, the sort of what I think is the standard idea of the discovery of the opinion leaders was by Paul Lazarsfeld in 1940, and Lazarsfeld was working at that point in the United States and doing research on elections and how influence was passed along in elections. And he was working at an organization shortly thereafter at an organization called or a portion of something that became part of Columbia University that was the Bureau of Applied Social Research. And there he had a group of students, and they basically funded a lot of the work by doing applied work for industry of one kind or another. And the pharmaceutical industry was not well represented for a bit, but then in the late 1950s, Pfizer commissioned a study through the Bureau of Applied Social Research. And Lazarsfeld's student, Elihu Katz, recalls that, that Pfizer wanted to know about the effectiveness of its ad campaign on doctors' decision-making. And then Katz responded, well, let me tell you about this interesting research we have on opinion leaders. And this is because Pfizer was spending a huge amount of money on its ads. And for those who have read the book on the Sacklers, the Empire of Pain, it was actually specifically Arthur Sackler's ads for tetracycline that were at issue in this particular study. But the study was really focused on opinion leaders. So Katz sort of developed a study that used records from pharmacies. And this was kind of novel at the time, although it's now become very standard in some areas, to identify, who was making the first, when people were making first prescriptions of tetracycline, and then mapped social networks of doctors through interviews. And the result was something like this, that there was kind of a chain reaction for doctors who were well integrated, and then there was a certain amount of evidence that this was driven by by the opinion leaders. I'll come back to this at the very end of the talk. So this is a kind of idealized model of what the opinion leader does. The opinion leader is somebody who is respected in the field and has a kind of asymmetric influence on doctors around them. Well, doctors in this case, but opinion leaders exist in all fields. So Pfizer appreciated the research so much that they asked the Bureau of Applied Social Research not to publish it, and when it was published with a pseudonym for the drug, and they called it Gamma-Nim instead of tetracycline. But it's unclear to me exactly what happened once this information became sort of part of the Pfizer corporate structure. But then we start seeing, over the following 20, 30 years, different companies sort of making use of the opinion leader idea and using it in some interesting and novel ways, not necessarily anticipated by Lazarsfeld and Katz and others. So I'm going to talk about the pharmaceutical industry's key opinion leaders, or the industry, of course, which always needs to aggrandize everything, went from the opinion leader to the key opinion leader. And so that became standard within the industry, or the KOL, sometimes thought leaders, but more generally, KOL is the standard term. And sometimes the industry is very blunt about exactly what it is. So in this ad, or in this article, Water Meadow, which is a medical education communication company, writes that KOLs are a convenient shorthand for those people, usually eminent, usually physicians, who we co-opt into our development and marketing strategies. Okay, I use a combination of data from what I think of as the gray literature. This is the literature with internal newsletters for the pharmaceutical industry, but I also I attend conferences and workshops that are also intended for people working in the pharmaceutical industry or working closely outside for agencies that might be employed by pharmaceutical companies. So I'm going to talk about two different kinds of KOLs. There are lots of distinctions that roughly map onto this. I've just simplified them to two: local KOLs and researcher KOLs. And so the local KOLs this is where the bulk of the industry's budget for KOLs gets spent. It's the local KOLs. Local KOLs give what are in the United States called promotional talks. And the promotional talks are, in a sense, really highly regulated by the companies, especially, but also to some extent by the FDA. So we have people who say very clearly here, like, so the sales representative writes, I would give them the information that I wanted them to talk about. I would give them the slides. They would go through specific training programs on what to say, what not to say, how to answer specific questions, etc. And then there are these training programs. We can see an example in this little snippet from an ad by Wave Healthcare. It's vital that advocates are able to communicate and influence colleagues with clarity and conviction. To ensure speakers are at the top of the game, we have developed a communication skills program for clinicians. So these local KOLs are not necessarily pre-existing opinion leaders. These local KOLs are people who are, in some sense, recruited to become speakers, giving these pre-written talks and communicating them to others. They're told that they cannot deviate from the script, as it were. So here we have Dr. Khan. This is from Interview. These are pseudonyms, by the way. In the book I give pseudonyms with names starting with K to all the key opinion leaders. But so this is interview data, but I generally use pseudonyms for people I encounter at these workshops and conferences too, even if they are, in a sense, speaking on the record. Anyway, so Dr. Khan says, when you're out there doing a talk, you really have to follow those rules to a T. If you don't follow those rules, then you're at risk of, breaking procedure. And I mean, arguably, I guess you're at risk of breaking the law. And this is something that these local KOLs are told repeatedly. And this is in interviews with them. This comes through very, very clearly that they are told they must stick to the script. Of course, we can see advantages for the pharmaceutical industry beyond regulatory advantages. We can see advantages for these speakers to be sticking to the script. The regulatory advantages are simple. The regulatory advantages are that there shouldn't be too much overt off-label prescription, but the company advantages are probably in a sense, the more obvious ones, which is if we know that Dr. Khan and his colleagues are sticking to the script, then we know that they are doing the right kind of promotional work. Here we have a similar kind of quote. I won't read this out, but Dr. King says something similar, again, in an interview. So he says, I have to use the slide deck that they provide me. I'm not allowed to alter it in any way. And so this allows a kind of consistency of message that the talks are given that the talks include a lot of the keywords that the company might want to accompany the product, and so on and so forth. So these local KOLs, who might not have been existing opinion leaders in Paul Azarsfeld's sense, become more prominent. They're given, they may give as many as 100 talks in a year, and the sales reps and medical science liaisons perhaps give them audiences. The sales reps recruit audiences, typically of other physicians, sometimes of other prescribers, and as a result, the KOLs' careers are built. So let me turn from the local KOLs to researcher KOLs. And researcher KOLs are the kind of people who are somewhat less controlled by the industry, and they are often asked to give talks, not just to after dinner talks to physicians or clinic talks in clinics or hospitals or something like that, but maybe also at conferences. These are people who are presumed to have some kind of a presence in the research literature on their own, or at least appearing to be independent from the pharmaceutical companies. So we have people at a workshop on KOL management, and I'll come back to that briefly. But a workshop on KOL management is the standard term that the people in the industry hate it, but they seem to need it somehow. For example, there was an invited KOL who was asked to talk about what it was like to give to be a KOL, and this is a person I'll call Dr. Kessel. And Dr. Kessel started off as a local KOL, giving promotional talks, speaking from those company slide sets. But then he became established as a researcher, perhaps with the help of pharmaceutical companies for which he was working. And so he came to wear a hat, not as a well-connected and thoughtful local physician presenting other people's data, but as a research scientist presenting his own. So local KOLs can graduate to become researcher KOLs. So this doctor, Dr. Kessel, right, as it says at the workshop I attended, in the past decade, I've been a consultant to the manufacturer of every compound that has been developed for the treatment of depression or the treatment of bipolar disorder, and some number of other compounds that haven't made it through the stages of development. So you can see that this is a prominent person. And indeed, Dr. Kessel is a very prominent person. Again, this is a pseudonym, so don't go looking for Dr. Kessel, please. So then he becomes this sort of national and then internationally known figure, and he can engage in all sorts of things, so in all sorts of activities. So he might, for example, he has, for example, worked with the FDA in terms of regulatory reviews, and perhaps other regulators around the world. And he has served as the author on many publications that were developed by pharmaceutical companies. This is standard. I was just doing some research with a colleague, Maud Bernisson, on the opioid manufacturer Mallinckrodt, and you can really see how there's the development of KOLs by the firm, who are then the very first people to whom the firm goes when they have a ghost-written manuscript or a project that is going to result in a ghost-written or ghost-managed manuscript. They bring on board some of the people that they've been kind of developing and recruiting over the years as KOLs. So this is a fairly standard path. KOL management, as I said, this is a standard term for the interaction between the companies and the KOLs. And so you have sort of other companies, I'll call them agencies, not pharmaceutical companies, that develop tools for KOL management, tools for the identification of potential KOLs, tools for the training and the introduction of those KOLs to the products in question, and so on and so forth. So in the end, this is a bit of a joke here I've put in, but as we can see from this image from an advertisement, from the point of view of a pharmaceutical company, the different departments that they have dwarf the KOLs, and so the KOLs can be expected to engage in the sorts of activities that the companies want them to engage in. How are KOLs recruited? Well, the entry point is often the advisory board. And advisory boards take all sorts of different shapes and have different kinds of sort of relevance to the pharmaceutical companies. Sometimes they genuinely seek advice, but that's probably a minority of cases. Most advisory boards are actually about the development of KOLs rather than the development of products independent of all this marketing. And you can see this. You can see in complaints by people who are engaged in the work of doing advisory boards that that there might be sort of 20 parallel advisory boards, and all the information collected from these KOLs, all the information collected from these physicians, just goes in the bottom of some file cabinet and never gets seen again. So advisory boards might be sometimes collecting advice, but often they're about communication to the KOLs, communication to them that they are valuable, and communication about the particular products. And again, in this recent project on Mallinckrodt, we see that very clearly. We see some advisory boards sort of come out with detailed notes and plans for different manuscripts and so on and so forth. And that's kind of that. But I think that that's the exception. And other advisory boards are occasions to gather together KOLs and pay them perhaps for them to bring their families on a nice little vacation, but they're ways of communicating to these KOLs that the company finds them valuable. So that's recruitment. But then once you've recruited, then you can have a kind of continuing demonstration of the value of the KOLs. I know that David Healy spoke to this group not that long ago, and a while ago he said it's a glittering social thing. They hire the opera house in Copenhagen for a meal, etc., etc. And he said his wife was upset that he dropped out of the KOL business. And then there's just the basic academic thing. So Dr. Katz, this is a quote from another workshop. He says, when you're being asked to be the thought leader, that's a bullseye exactly where academics live. They want to be thought leaders. And this is him explaining why he was participating with the companies, because they were offering him an opportunity to be a thought leader. So these researcher KOLs are paid to speak. First continuing medical educations, but also specialists at conferences. Sometimes they help with regulatory approval, and then they're authors on on medical papers to which they may have contributed a greater or a lesser extent. And I'm not going to talk about ghost-written or ghost-managed papers. I've done a lot of research on that in the past, and if you want to talk about that in the question period, I'll be happy to talk about that, but I'm going to leave it aside from here. So again, in all of this, the KOLs are managed. So back to Dr. Kessel, that physician researcher who graduated from being a local KOL to a researcher KOL, he describes in his talk how serving as an expert witness in a court case, he had seen, as part of a plaintiff's efforts to discredit him, the, quote, individual management plan for him by the company being sued. And the individual management plan, he reports, says something like, so-and-so will meet with him on such and such a date with this expected result, and then we'll invite him to do this. And so he said, this is really embarrassing to come up in a court case. The companies, the pharmaceutical companies shouldn't be sort of talking in these terms. But they find it very, very difficult to not to talk in these terms. Because this is indeed what they expect from him. And he says that he's not naive. He knows that they're expecting these things, but he wishes that there were a little bit more respect of his expertise, etc. So these KOLs are sometimes criticized by other physicians, and they're called paid stooges or something like that, or even drug whores. One KOL says. When I did interviews with a group of very highly paid KOLs, my focus was actually on how they were sort of thinking about and justifying their work, and they think of it in terms of if they believe what they are saying, then they can always justify their work in terms of communicating scientific or clinical truths. And this as long as they maintain their integrity and they can say that they believe the truths, then they are comfortable in their position at working closely with the pharmaceutical industry, being paid by the industry for engaging in these activities. But we can ask, of course, which truths. And I also think perhaps more important than just which truths, sort of which KOLs become promoted in this way. Right? Because the KOLs do end up with this asymmetric influence because they are given platforms and audiences. And what they communicate may very well be backed up by data, but the platforms but the KOLs are chosen in terms of sort of how they can communicate these things that the industry wants them to communicate, and then the audiences are presumably going to value what gets communicated. So that integrity that they might have in virtue of communicating the truths as they see them is integrity that is part of a system in which certain kinds of truths or certain kinds of data get amplified and other kinds of data do not get amplified. So we can see this as part of a system for shaping the kind of things that doctors know, the kind of things that count as medical knowledge altogether. And so as a result, the pharmaceutical industry has this asymmetric influence on opinions. We might sort of note that this is really different from the kind of model with which Paul Lazarsfeld started in 1940, where he was thinking in terms of pre-existing influential people. Here we have a system in which the pharmaceutical industry can make people influential and sort of has and can create this asymmetric influence on opinions kind of in a very, very widespread way. I mean, in terms of the local KOLs, and a project that of promoting a new drug might involve 1,000 people giving talks for a short while. And that is deemed to be worth it for the pharmaceutical industry. Oh, incidentally, if you question this, there is actually a small amount of research available showing that KOLs have while they might be more expensive than hiring sales representatives to do the same job, KOLs have a higher level of influence on their colleagues in terms of the number of dollars of prescriptions, or number of the value, the monetary value of prescriptions that are made. So it can be worth the pharmaceutical industry's paying a fair number of KOLs to communicate what they want to communicate. And I think of this as resulting in a kind of epistemic corruption of medicine. The industry has taken a set of forms of communication, the talks, the talk to scientific conferences, the talk, and added to them and grafted onto medicine a kind of a separate set of activities, or similar sets of activities that sometimes sort of become part of medicine, accepted part of medicine, like the clinic talk, like the after dinner talk. These become an accepted part of medicine. And so I think of this as in a sense, as I say, grafted onto the activities, sort of standard ways of communication that are accepted within medicine, and sometimes overtaking all other forms of communication of information. The KOLs in their capacity as authors of ghost-managed publications, ghost-written publications, in their capacity of that, there you can see another way in which the industry is taking a form of communication, the research paper, published in medical journals, and is making that form a useful way of communicating the kinds of results, the specific results that companies might want to communicate about their products. And so I'll just close by I want to sort of suggest that that the systems by which medical knowledge is most often communicated can lose integrity through this kind of process when you have interested parties. The companies, are deeply invested in certain kinds of kinds of data, and they're deeply invested in the data that support their products. And as a result, the systems of medical communication as a whole can lose integrity. And therefore, I think we can see these systems as a whole we can see loss of trust in the kind of knowledge that gets communicated. So I will stop there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sergio. So if you close your presentation and everyone could turn their cameras on, please raise your hand to ask questions. Okay. So Sergio, I'll start. I think there were quite a few changes in the recent years. A lot of regulation came into the industry, what kind of gifts are allowed, what kind of gifts are not allowed. As you just quoted, there are no more trips to the Met or to the golf courses. Has this changed the outcomes, or it's simply switched from one means of attracting KOLs to other means or using other technologies? Has the influence diminished? Has it increased? Has it stayed the same, even though the certain things have been forbidden, so to speak?
Yeah, I don't think I have seen any evidence of the influence diminished. It does take different forms. Now, one can pay an honorarium to a speaker that is just a little bit larger, and the opera house, the Copenhagen Opera House, doesn't have to be engaged. Um, I also heard that there are even hotels that have dropped the number of stars that they claim because because of the regulations about where people can be put up for events. And so if the hotel can say, well, we're no longer a 5-star hotel or something like that, we're really only a 3-star hotel, but that means that they become an acceptable venue for pharmaceutical industry events. So I think that there are ways around the regulation, as there always are. I was introduced to a statement by the scholar Jerry Ravitz, who said every system comes with a racket. Basically, every time that you create a regulation, people find new ways of creatively evading the regulation. But I think more importantly is that the sets of activities that are going on haven't changed appreciably, right? As long as as long as the industry uses KOLs to communicate its preferred data, its preferred results, it doesn't really matter that for at least for that activity, that the gifts have diminished.
Thank you. Mark, please go ahead. You're muted.
Thank you. So I've been researching a particular drug that goes back to the 90s, and I'm looking at this sort of strafing of the literature, both in the United States and in Europe, in dermatology journals. And I noticed that there are disclosures of conflicts of interest in the American journals. And I see that the disclosures in the European dermatology journals seem like there won't be any. And I'm wondering if there is let's say in the 2000s, I don't know if you know, was there a difference in disclosure policies in journals in, say, Europe and the US or North America?
Interesting question or interesting observation. I didn't think that there were different policies, but I'm sure you're right that you're seeing a pattern. So I wish I could answer that properly, but I honestly didn't think that there were different policies, at least across the board. Okay. One thing that this may or may not be relevant to your, to the material that you're looking at. I think that if something is if something is an article reporting on a clinical study of some kind, let's say an RCT, but not necessarily even an RCT, then there tends to be a fairly generous acknowledgements of conflicts, but also other contributors who are not necessarily authors. And I've seen that both in American and European journals. But then when the contribution is something more like a letter or a review, a narrative review or something like that, then the contributions of non-authors, and typically these are things that are authored by a single or two people, as opposed to the clinical studies that are authored by 6-8 people, then the disclosures are much more limited in those narrative reviews or letters or something like that, even if one finds out later on that they were written within the company or developed within the company.
I saw that once. I did see that once. I think it was Glaxo. And just a quick sort of remark, and then I'll pass it on. I now, in the more recent trials, like there was a dermatology trial in, I think, the New England Journal or JAMA, and the conflict of interest statement was so long that it was actually longer than some articles. I mean, it was like 1,800 words. And so in some sense, I think maybe they're more explicit and thorough, but like under in another way, things haven't changed.
Oh, right. Yeah. If you're just swamped with information about, if every one of the authors has had connections to 5 different companies, and then you list all of that, and yet then you find yourself swamped with information, you really have nothing. You have nothing at the end.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, this is a very interesting observation, how a particular policy or new rule introduction doesn't actually change the practice or reality in terms of Sunshine Act. And you can look up any clinician and how much money they received from the industry, and you can see this long list of conflict of interest reporting in the journal. Everyone is very transparent. Everyone is just saying, yes, I've done that. I've taken this money. Business as usual, nothing changes. So, and very interesting how particular enforcement of transparency does not really bring results one would have expected. So, Michael, please go ahead with your question.
Thanks for letting me join. I'm actually not far. I'm in Kingston, in the unfashionable West End now of Ontario, Canada, and I got interested in kind of tapering medications because I had a hard time with it, and I couldn't find a lot of information. So I couldn't get good information from doctors, and I did like a lot of research, as you do, and you read like 20 papers, and I finally figured out dose steps to kind of get off it more gently. But I immediately noticed all these disclosure just statements that you're talking about, and as an engineer, when I see that, like I read it with very high amount of suspicion, and I assume it's alloyed by commercial interests. And it's not common, like all science, there's value in all science papers, but it's not common for me not to find any papers that aren't alloyed by obvious conflict of interest, or at least the credible appearance of a possible conflict of interest. And there was nothing that I thought was reliable enough to go on. And I kind of, as I went deeper into it, like I'm right down in the rabbit hole now. And I attended a conference at which they were describing how drugs are homologated or approved. And they just look at published papers, and they kind of make bar graphs of effect sizes, and the effect sizes are not that great, honestly, and they're hyper focused on the statistics of the width of the bars of the effect size, and it's very strange, like it's passing strange the way these drugs are approved. And they are talking now about real world evidence, and I asked, okay, so if the evidence to homologate or approve a drug is this, it seems quite weak. The real world evidence to kind of remove from the market, why should there be a different standard? And if there's 10,000 patients saying there are problems, why should the standard be different? And I think it should be just as easy to remove it from the market, like the bar should be equally low. So I just wondered if you have any comments about that. I'm of course like immersed in this community that's quite angry, but I'm trying to figure out what the hell is going on. There was a lot there, but I wondered if you have any comments on it.
So, I mean, yeah, there is a lot there. I think that we are in an era where there is enough profit to be made from pharmaceuticals, from especially prescription pharmaceuticals, that that the industry can engage with sort of as many researchers as it wants to, or companies can engage with as many researchers as they want to. And this is why when you're looking at the literature, you're not seeing too many independent researchers, or you're not seeing enough independent researchers. So there's a sense, and this is sort of why I introduced the phrase epistemic corruption, because I think that once you have enough of a mass of this interested research, then in a sense the whole of medicine is no longer trustworthy. It isn't easy enough to find the independent research, and frankly, medical research is tricky at the best of times, and it's difficult to find really clear results, in most areas, whether it's about drugs or not about drugs. So we're in a difficult terrain, and then you have an industry that can make a lot of money on this terrain, and also that we depend upon scientific information for our evidence about drugs. This is the way that the whole system is set up. This isn't it no longer just circulates as sort of doctors with their opinions, because there is this, we hope for strong scientific evidence for whatever it is that we might want to do or not do. As for the issue about regulation, I agree. I would go stronger. I think that we should probably have something like a 10-year moratorium on new drugs right now while we just kind of sort things out. But that's perhaps a radical position. I don't think for the doctors in the group, I think that one should generally not prescribe anything that has been approved in the past 10 or 15 years. And you'd be wise to just go back on the tried and true, and or at least the things that where the effects and the adverse events. So, but that's just a view on which that I have.
Thank you, Sergio.
Thanks so much. I wish I hadn't looked into how the sausages are made, and now that I know, I can't let it go. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
We have a whole lineup of questions. So, Francois, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you, Sergio. Sorry, my question has a slightly different focus. Do you have any evidence that you have focused mostly, and I understand, on clinicians, but do you have any kind of evidence that the industry is shifting the choice of key opinion leaders towards patients, to try to have patients advocates, to let's say, to request products, or to get to do some promotion on products?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for bringing up. That's just another facet of the marketing activity, and I really think that's standard now, and it's standard especially for very expensive treatments. Treatments for rare diseases and things like that, where you can get patient advocates. Patient advocates can be easily found and then developed and recognized. And again, the process can work very much like the key opinion leader development process. So I attended a meeting where there was actually there was a sub-portion of the meeting that was devoted to new patient advocates, and then there was a set of seminars for these new patient advocates about effective patient advocacy, and there was even a prize given to a patient advocate for their work on behalf of one or another drug. I don't remember what it was. But you see this a lot with cancer treatments and other things like that, where the drugs are extremely expensive, And often the research, especially as the conditions become more rare, the research is less and less obvious that shows less and less obvious benefits. So then you need a patient advocate to be saying, well, even though the research is showing only marginal benefits, we need to have this the opportunity to choose this product because this situation is so dire. And so everything that you suggested, I have done some research on it, and I just didn't present it today. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think we see it especially in these very expensive treatments. We've been setting records in terms of expensive treatments basically every year for the past 15 years. And there's a brand new one that beats all previous.
Thank you for this perspective. Indeed, a lot of patient organizations are pharma funded, and also patient perspective sometimes is understandable, because when you're in a desperate situation, philosophical discussions will not get you far, neither hope. So there's choice of pharmaceutical drug or church. So people make their choices where they take money from or where they take their money to. So very controversial issues, but also there are many sides to the story. And sometimes it's unfortunate that patients are influenced this way, but you can see why it's easy to persuade them, because for them, it's the only hope sometimes and the only way forward, at least the way they see it. So David, please go ahead, and then Adam.
Yes, in 2011, I think it was, there was a meeting at Imperial College on open data and so on. And I was on a panel sitting next to Mark Walport, who was then director of the Wellcome Trust, subsequently became chief scientific advisor to the government. And I said, I wondered why it was that medicine, the caring profession, was the most corrupt of all professions. And Mark Walport was rather offended by that. I'm afraid it's true, though. But do you think that's because of the lack of evidence in medicine and the fact that most things can't be cured still leads to exaggerated claims? Or do you think it's well, what's the alternative? Are doctors really more greedy for money than anybody else? Or is it just that there's more money available?
So I think that the first and the last are true. I don't want to pronounce on whether doctors are particularly greedy. I as a general principle, I would assume that doctors are no more or less greedy than anybody else. That if any other industry had the opportunity to be corrupt, and some of them are, like I might question whether real estate is less corrupt than medicine. But anyway, given the opportunity, I think almost any group of people would seize it. So there definitely is more money available, more money floating around, more sort of the money is it seems to me untethered, because in the sense that the industry, the pharmaceutical industry, especially the medical device industry, which I didn't talk about at all here, but is very similar. But those are the most profitable industries in the world, if you look at them as industries. So if they're more profitable than big oil.
Yeah. Yes.
So there's a lot of money that can just be spent on whatever projects these companies want to engage in. And I think you're right about the problems of evidence. We generally treat as an advance any treatment that has sort of a fairly marginal demonstrated benefit over the placebo, or right. So we don't usually get results that are just clean, where we say this drug, this procedure just has a 98, 95% success rate. That's a rare thing in medicine. So so then we're always working with the margins, and we have to interpret everything in statistically. So I standardly joke that I think that one of the best drugs developed over the past 30, 40 years is Viagra, because most of the people who take Viagra see a fairly immediate response. They don't need to go to the statistics to figure this out. Whereas a lot of people would be critical of that drug, would say, no, this is part of the problem, the manufacture of diseases, with which I agree. At least the drug, most people who take it, experience what they're looking for, right? So,
yes.
Whereas, say, your average statin, nobody can judge that the statin they're taking is effective at reducing their risk of cardiovascular events. That is impossible to judge. You have to go to the statistics, and then the statistical benefits are very, very marginal. But we accept that. And we, I say we as a society, but people in medicine accept these marginal benefits.
Yes, I take a statin, but I took it mainly because my GP gets paid by the health service for prescribing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Adam, please go ahead.
I work in the pharmaceutical industry, and I wanted to bring to your attention a situation and get your thoughts on it, where the key opinion leaders sit on the scientific advisory board. They're one and the same. And as members of the scientific advisory board, they can get compensation. Mm-hmm. And so it gets an end run around the issue of honorarium or fancy hotels by just flat out paying them in the form of stock options or whatever to be on the board. And then they go out and are first authors on papers, as well as, I would add, in many cases, what I'd call shills for the company. They'll go out and say, hey, this is a great finding, when the data might not support it. So it's sort of just a way to get around external people by really just having them essentially as employees, but covering them in this veneer of independence, as they're not employees, they're independent doctors of this university or that university, but they're getting paid and they're out there running the trial. So it's kind of closing the loop and getting these people really essentially as employees of the company. But I have to duck off for a meeting myself in a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention, ask your thoughts on how that could be regulated slightly better.
Mm-hmm. That's one way in which sort of high level KOLs get rewarded for what they're doing. How could this be regulated better? Well, I think this might be a case where medicine needs to self-regulate to some extent and start sort of creating sort of maximum levels of reimbursement in terms of stock options and the rest. And we need, if you want to maintain a license, then you have to be below this threshold. Maybe the threshold should be 0. I don't know. But there might be a case for self-regulation as opposed to external regulation. There probably are ways of regulating it externally too. But I can't think of them offhand.
Anyway, well, thank you for working on this. I got to duck off, but thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. Good to see someone from the industry sharing their perspectives. Yeah. So we have a question in the chat, and there were some really, really good comments in the chat if you have a moment to read them. But since we're out of time, I'd like to just read a question from Joanna. So what are your thoughts on the preparation that young doctors and medical students are given to be equipped for the conflicts of interest they'll face throughout their careers? And I know many medical universities here in Germany don't have conflict of interest policies. And from anecdotal US evidence, it doesn't seem like conflict of interest is discussed in medical schools. Do future doctors even have a chance at navigating these waters? And to what degree is medical education biased if many KOL researchers are also faculty members, professors, etc.? So please, Sergio.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to give both a pessimistic and an optimistic response to that. Let me start with the optimistic one. I actually see a lot of medical students being aware of these kinds of issues and starting organizations that object to things. So there's the No Free Lunch movement in the United States, which is a very much a medical students organization. So we see that students are to some extent aware of that. I've also heard, and this is entirely anecdotal, but I've heard people who are working with the company complaining about how medical students act, and that the medical students are being too critical of pharmaceutical companies and too aware of conflicts of interest. So there's maybe some hope for optimism as the awareness might be just growing gradually. And the students do sometimes object to particular speakers coming in if the speakers are clearly sort of presenting a position of a company for which they work or for which they have conflicts of interest or something like that. So that's one thing. On the other hand, I think that the attitude within the industry is that this is just youthful exuberance, and when these medical students graduate, when they get 5 years out of their graduation, out of the medical school, then they start realizing that there are advantages to working with pharmaceutical companies in terms of the information that they receive and in terms of the abilities to be in their practices. So I think that's the pessimistic side, which is even if we could do a lot of work to convince medical students of the importance of conflicts of interest, they may very well lose that as real world pressures bear in on them.
All right, so I agree with you. I do also see quite a bit of movement in the younger generation trying to change the current practices, not just with conflict of interest, but other things that seem to be going wrong in medicine, interpretation and collection of evidence. So indeed, there is some hope. But Sergio, just to finish, would you make a one point of advice? Because I don't think we are improving very much in the situation. We can really change things overnight. Money win, and industry can buy the opinions that they want. So one bit of advice to either people who read the papers or the patients or public, what are your thoughts?
One piece of advice. I'm just going to sort of say the same thing that I said before. For those of you who are in medicine, just discount almost everything that is about recently approved products. You can basically assume that it is the hands of the pharmaceutical industry have played an enormous role in that. And it's not until the products stop becoming profitable that evidence sort of loses, that the industry sort of loses interest in the shaping of that information. So then you start seeing, then you start knowing much better what are the pluses and minuses of any given treatment. So it's hard to give advice to everybody, but that's just for prescribers.